The embers of the fire popped, throwing a brief shower of orange sparks into the heavy, humid night air. Out here, miles past the edge of any paved road, the darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It felt like a physical weight pressing against the trees. The woods of the Pine Barrens had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the rhythmic scraping of cricket legs and the distant, unsettling wail of a whippoorwill. If you listened closely enough, you could almost hear the forest breathing, waiting for the fire to die down. It was on a night exactly like this, 40 years ago, that a man named Silas Vance decided to build his homestead deep within these very woods. Silas wasn't a man who cared for the company of townsfolk. He preferred the quiet, predictable nature of the wilderness. He built a modest one-room cabin from the local cedar logs, cleared a small patch of land for a garden, and settled into a life of complete isolation. For the first few years, the forest gave him everything he needed, and he believed he had finally found a place of absolute peace. But the wilderness is rarely truly empty, and it is never entirely predictable. By the third winter, a strange biting frost settled over the valley, one that seemed to seep straight into the marrow of Silas's bones. The game he usually hunted vanished overnight, as if every deer, rabbit and fox had fled the woods in a sudden panic. The silence that followed was different from the peaceful quiet he was used to. It was a tense, breathless silence, the kind that precedes a terrible storm. One evening, as Silas sat by his hearth trying to stretch his remaining rations, he heard a sound that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping against the side of his cabin. At first he tried to dismiss it as a loose branch catching the wind, but there was no wind that night. The sound was deliberate, steady, and horribly rhythmic. Tap, 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 moving slowly along the exterior logs from the front corner of the cabin toward the single grease-paper window. Silas grabbed his rifle, his knuckles turning white against the wooden stock, and crept toward the window. He wiped away the condensation and peered out into the moonlit clearing. The snow was pristine and unbroken, casting a pale, ghostly glow across the yard. There were no footprints, no shadows, and no branches close enough to touch the wood. Yet the moment he pulled his face away from the pane, the tapping began again, right on the glass itself. He didn't sleep that night, nor the night after. Every evening, precisely as the last sliver of sunlight dipped below the tree line, the tapping would return. It began to evolve, moving from the walls to the roof, a heavy, dragging weight that scrambled across the cedar shingles like a massive, multi-legged insect. Silas could hear the timbers groan under the pressure, but whenever he bolted outside with his lantern, he found nothing but the empty, mocking expanse of the dark woods. Driven by a mix of sleep deprivation and growing desperation, Silas decided to seek answers. He packed a small rucksack and walked a full day's journey back toward the edge of the nearest town, stopping at a dilapidated trading post run by an old hunter named Abraham. Abraham had lived near the woods his entire life and knew the folklore of the region better than anyone alive. Silas sat by the iron stove and recounted the phantom tapping, watching as the colour slowly drained from the old hunter's weathered face. Abraham didn't laugh, nor did he tell Silas he was losing his mind. Instead, he leaned in close and spoke in a harsh whisper, warning Silas of the Bone Picker, an ancient, forgotten entity that local legends claimed dwelt in the deepest, uncharted hollows of the forest. According to the old stories, it was a creature born of starvation and isolation, a manifestation of the wood's hidden malice. It didn't attack its prey directly. Instead, it stalked them, wearing down their sanity with sound until they willingly opened their doors to the dark. "Whatever you do, Silas," Abraham warned, his eyes wide and unblinking, "do not acknowledge it. Do not speak to it. Do not look for it. And under no circumstances are you to open your door after sunset. If it knows you're listening, it won't stop until it finds a way inside." Silas walked back to his cabin that afternoon, the weight of Abraham's words heavy on his chest. The sun was already dipping low, casting long skeletal shadows across the trail. By the time he reached his clearing, the forest was completely dark. He bolted the heavy oak door behind him, threw 3 large logs onto the fire, and sat in the center of the room with his rifle across his knees, determined to ignore whatever noises the night might bring. Right on cue, the tapping began. Tap, tap, tap. It started at the back wall, but this time it was louder, sharper, sounding less like a branch and more like the click of a long, overgrown fingernail against the wood. Silas squeezed his eyes shut and began to recite a sensory checklist in his mind, focusing on the warmth of the fire and the smell of the burning pine, desperate to drown out the noise outside. Then the sound changed. The rhythmic tapping ceased, replaced by a low scraping sound that dragged its way up the front door. Silas held his breath. Suddenly, a voice drifted through the cracks in the floorboards. It didn't sound like a monster. It sounded like Abraham, perfectly mimicking the old hunter's gravelly tone. "Silas, open up," the voice pleaded, trembling with an artificial fear. "The storm caught me on the trail. It's freezing out here. Let me in." Silas's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. For a split second, the urge to help his friend almost drove him to his feet. But then he remembered the timeline. Abraham was a full day's walk away, and there was no way the old man could have overtaken him on the trail. The voice outside lacked a certain human cadence, too. It was too repetitive, repeating the exact same phrase with the precise same inflection, over and over again. Realizing the trick had failed, the voice dissolved into a horrific gurgling screech that echoed through the chimney. The scratching on the door grew frantic, mutating into a violent pounding that threatened to splinter the thick oak. The cabin shook to its foundations. Silas buried his head in his hands, shouting at the top of his lungs just to block out the cacophony of scratching, howling, and the terrible sound of wooden beams cracking under an immense unseen pressure. Just when he thought the roof would collapse inward, the commotion stopped. A suffocating silence fell over the clearing. The fire in the hearth had died down to a dull, crimson glow, casting long, distorted shadows across the cabin walls. Silas slowly lifted his head, his body trembling from exhaustion and terror. He looked toward the greasepaper window, hoping against hope that the ordeal was finally over. There, pressed flat against the glass, was a face. It was entirely devoid of features, no eyes, no nose, just a pale, smooth stretch of skin tightly wound over a sharp, angular skull. But at the bottom of the face, a wide, lipless maw stretched from ear to ear, filled with rows of thin, needle-like teeth. The entity wasn't looking at Silas with eyes. It was sensing him, absorbing his terror through the thin pane of glass that separated them. Silas froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the sight. The creature raised a long skeletal hand, its fingers ending in elongated yellowed bones that lacked skin entirely. Slowly, deliberately, it tapped a single bone against the window pane. Tap. The glass cracked. Silas let out a breathless gasp, a tiny sound of pure despair that broke the absolute quiet of the room. The moment that small sound escaped his lips, the creature's grin widened, splitting its pale face almost in half. It knew he was listening. It knew he was broken. With a sickening screech of shifting weight, the entity vanished from the window, and Silas heard the heavy, dragging sound scramble back up onto the roof, directly above the weakened timbers of the ceiling. Nobody ever saw Silas Vance alive again. When Abraham grew worried a week later and led a search party out to the isolated clearing, they found the cabin standing completely intact from the outside. The door was still bolted securely from the interior, and the window, though cracked, was unbroken. But when they finally forced their way inside, the cabin was entirely empty, save for a thick layer of fine grey ash covering the floor. The search party found no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no tracks in the surrounding woods. The only clue left behind was carved deeply into the wooden mantelpiece above the cold fireplace, scratched out in frantic, uneven strokes that looked as though they had been gouged by a human fingernail. The message read, "It doesn't want to come in. It wants us to come out." The storyteller paused, looking around the circle of faces illuminated by the dying campfire. The woods behind them seemed a little closer now, the shadows a little deeper. As if on cue, a sudden gust of wind swept through the campsite, causing the flames to dance and hiss violently. And there, just at the very edge of the clearing, right where the firelight met the dark, came a faint rhythmic sound from the bark of a massive pine tree. Tap, tap, tap.